Fantasy genre has changed quite tremendously over the last 5 years. When we have something like 2020 as a pretty definitive starting point for where we started to have trends shift, I wanted to take a look back at the last 5 years. If we include 2020 within that, then 2020 through 2024, which has now come to a close, can give us some insight into how we feel that fantasy has changed and what its trajectory might be. I have noted that I definitely think there has become a lot more emphasis on fantasy standalones. And it's really interesting to see that shift, as not so long ago, I remember there being a craving for a lot more fantasy standalones. It felt like it was extremely popular to have these epic series with really intense stakes, and the scope of them was tremendous, but a lot of people didn't necessarily have the time and the means, or they felt intimidated by the fantasy genre. And the fantasy standalone, I think, has resulted in the genre feeling much more inviting. And I'm really grateful that that has, I think, proven true, at least from my assessment. Fantasy seems to be thriving in many ways. Obviously, you cannot discount the fact that certainly there being new apps that have entered the scene have played a role in the success of not just this genre, but books overall. There are certain articles that have popped up showcasing that places like Barnes & Noble are actually expanding for the first time in years. It wasn't so long ago where a lot of bookstores were shutting their doors. So it does make me quite happy to see that not only has this genre seen a lot more eyes on it, but that books in general are becoming something a lot more people are finding themselves in love with. I think that that's great. It's a wonderful hobby. It's a wonderful way to enrich your life. And I think reading in general, I think this is fairly undebatable. Most of us would say that it allows for individuals to practice empathy every single day when they put themselves in the shoes of these fictional characters that authors have created for us. That said, there are some shifts that I was curious if I were to really look back with my personal taste, of course, being a part of this conversation, as I believe that books are quite subjective. Our experiences with art in general, no matter what the form of art is, you're going to come to it with your own experiences, and you're going to put that onto the work, and you're going to see things from the work differently than someone else would. So I recognize that in the conversation today, that a lot of my personal subjective taste is going to be present. So I invite you to maybe follow along with what I'm going to be doing today and see if the answer for you to has fantasy gotten worse, or has it gotten better, or has it primarily stayed the same? If you want to follow in the same, essentially game almost, you could say, that we're going to be doing today, you can do that same thing, and then you can follow up and say whether or not the results were similar, drastically different, or somewhere in the middle for you. The way I'm going to be looking at this, I know this is not the most in-depth criteria, but I wanted to specifically look at the Goodreads Choice Awards. I did a similar video not too long ago where I looked at the Goodreads Choice Awards leading up to the year of 2024. I just thought it'd be fun to do a look back. And I did a simple, do I think this was overrated, underrated, or appropriately, or I should say hyped? Do I think it was overhyped, underhyped, or appropriately hyped? That doesn't necessarily entirely capture my personal tastes, as some of them that I thought were fantastic were exceptionally hyped, which meant other people thought they were fantastic too, which then placed them in the appropriately hyped category. In actuality, I really loved those books, and maybe I would say I think they're deserving of the hype. It's just everybody also would, for the most part, agree. Everyone, of course, is a generalization. What I wanted to do today is a little bit different. One, it incorporates 2024's Goodreads Choice Award nominees, but on top of that, rather than looking at the hype level of these things, the Goodreads Choice Awards is already establishing the level of hype. And for almost every single year, we're going to be looking at books that I picked up within the top 10 as far as the amount of votes that they were given. And from there, I'm going to award points depending on how I categorize them. So the 3 sections, we have books that I think are great. These are books that, self-explanatory, I thought were phenomenal. I think they're easy 5 stars, maybe among some of my favorites. In the middle, we have the good category. This can be somewhere, if you want to think of it in a star rating range, just somewhere between 3 and 4 stars. They're pretty much in the middle. Maybe some of them lean a little higher, maybe some of them lean a little bit lower, but they're by no means books that I despised my time with. And then we have the books that are in the, what I'm going to categorize as like, category. These are books that some of them also, you could say, I didn't despise, but they certainly didn't fit my tastes. I wanted to assess if that was being true for the years following 2020, or if there were more books coming out that were my taste. And if you follow me, maybe you follow me because you have similar taste to me, so maybe there would be overlap, or maybe just in general you enjoy fantasy conversations about books in general, and so maybe you have a very different take, and I would love to know how this results for you. I awarded points per category. The bottom category, you get 1 point if you're in there. The middle category is 3 points, and then if you're in the top category, you get 5 points. Depending on the amount of books that I had read from the top 10 of the nominees, they will then have a possible score out of if you give every book the potential of 5 points. So for example, for the year 2020, there was a potential of 25 points that could be earned. And then I'm going to add up how many points actually there was. There will be a percentage, and then we'll compare the percentages over the course of those 5 years. The percentages that are among the highest are obviously the years that I really thought the books, there were a lot more standouts. And then the ones that are the lowest are the ones that those years were a little bit more so duds for me. Jumping into it and starting with the year of 2020, I had a total of half of the books within the top 10 from that year being books that I had picked up. And I actually had fairly extreme views. I either didn't like them or I loved them. The loved ones to this day are some of my favorites. For example, Rhythm of War, the 4th book in the Stormlight Archive. I really, really quite adore that. I really enjoy Empire of Gold. That is the 3rd book in the Chakraborty series, the Daevabad trilogy. Really quite loved that as well. And then Addie LaRue, which I definitely can see a lot of the criticisms for that, but the highs of that book I really did think were incredible, and it has stuck with me, and just that feeling of wanting to be remembered, and a lot of the themes that go into that I thought were quite powerful and moving. And I think Addie LaRue really allowed for there to be a stepping stone into fantasy, as this has a very broad reach in it's very inviting to a lot of people. That's not why I love it necessarily, but I do appreciate it for that. Regardless, I really quite enjoyed those books. There really weren't any that were kind of middle of the road for me, the ones that I didn't care for. And actually the 2 that I didn't care for this year are ones that absolutely are going to be considered greats for a lot of you, and I'm very aware of that, which is why I felt the need to spend some time on the subjective aspect of all of this. The books that I gave 1 point to for this year would be Piranesi. I have discussed before why Piranesi didn't work for me. Completely understand the experience that is that book. I recognize why it's so powerful and meaning to a lot of others, but it wasn't for me. And then House in the Cerulean Sea, which I know is absolutely a darling for so many people. This one, it was a little extra sweet for me, and while I really appreciate the themes, I just can't really say that this one pulled at my heart the way it did for a lot of other people, and as such, it went in this category. That meant the total of the 25 that actually was given to this year was 17 out of 25, which is not bad. That meant that the percentage for that year was 68%. And the reason that a percentage is important in this situation is because certain years I had the ability to read more of the books that were in the top 10 than in other years. So the total amount of points possible is different, which is why the percentages are going to be what we're basing things at the end of the video. But now switching to the year 2021. Unlike the year 2020, this one had nothing in the, oh my gosh, this is exceptional, I think this is one of the best things I've ever read. Most of the things went in the middle. I do want to note, part of what I think might have contributed to this is that in 2020, the effects of 2020 obviously wouldn't have impacted the books coming out that year, as those books would have already been written, and the authors' lives weren't impacted at that point by 2020 because they wrote the books prior to. They were just released in 2020, which is why I feel like we had some heavy hitters, even though we associate 2020 with a lot of negativity. 2021 is where I think you're starting to see some of the effects and some of those like greats for a lot of us. Maybe you'll disagree and you'll feel like some of the things that came out that year that didn't work for me were greats, but I think a lot of the strangeness was certainly felt in publishing, and as such for us readers as well in that year. Quite a few things were in the middle category though, Witch's Heart. I do really like this book. I want to make clear that, like I said, you can go all the way up to 4 stars within this rating, maybe inching into a little higher. So a lot of the books I quite liked. I really liked Witch's Heart. I really liked She Who Became the Sun. Really, really enjoyed that one. Really, really enjoyed Shadow of the Gods, definitely. And then Ariadne, I would say this one was on the lower end of the middle. All great. I really enjoyed these, just not necessarily all-time favorites, but these are some good series in my opinion. Then we have the ones that are in the category, which would be Under the Whispering Door. And then Orquídea Divina also is in this. This one for me, on a personal level, I just tend to not be as big of a fan of stories that are more generational in how they're told and also are more rooted in magical realism. Those are things that I just, in general, it's not necessarily this book in particular, it's just my tastes. Those tend to not line up with my tastes. So that's here for that reason. And as a result, all the points added up, we have 14 out of 30 possible points. And I'll let you know now, this was the weakest year for me. There not being anything in the this is outstanding, next to none sort of entries resulted in it being the lowest of the 5 years we're looking at, and it comes in at 46%. Moving to 2022, I know it's drastically different from the books that were in my greats in the year of 2020. I had one book that was considered a great, The Very Secret Society of Irregular Witches. I know, once again, that's different for a lot of people, which is why I was so adamant about please do this for yourself. I'd be interested to see. But I just found that story to be so, so darling. And it's funny because I do think there's a lot of parallels to it in House in the Cerulean Sea. It's just this one really worked for me. Anyway, the middle category had a lot of entries. Legends and Lattes came out that year and was nominated that year. Really enjoyed Legends and Lattes. The Lost Metal, while I don't love the ending, and if you read The Lost Metal, there's a lot of us that are like, why did that character have to say that and act like that at the end during this pivotal emotional moment? But anyway, I still thought that the book was incredibly fast-paced, it was explosive, it was fun, there was big reveals, and I did enjoy the reading experience. So that's in this category. Daughter of the Moon Goddess, I enjoyed this one. And then Babel, while I have some things about it I don't love and certain things I wish had been expanded on, and actually I wish we'd had more perspectives, still really feel like the themes in this were exceptional, and I would like more books to hit those themes and tackle them. And then probably the lowest of the middle, bordered on being in the but at the end of the day, I didn't dislike this reading experience, and I know this is different for a lot of people, but that would be the Atlas 6, which meant there was actually nothing in the bottom category of the top 10 of the nominees from that year. The percentage result then was 66%, pretty good, and it was 20 out of 30 possible points. Moving to 2023, we have, I'm going to start in the middle category. This one was the most evenly distributed. So in the middle category, we had Tress of the Emerald Sea. I think Tress is so cute and so darling and so fun. Then we had Amina al-Sarafi. Once again, fun. Great word to describe this one. Such a great action-adventure story. And then Bookshops and Bone Dust. Similar to Legends and Lattes, I also really enjoyed this one. I would say leans toward the higher end of this middle category, as I quite liked this, but not necessarily an all-time favorite. For the favorites, though, we have Encyclopedia of Fairies and Fragile Threads of Power. I do quite like the Shades of Magic series, which seems to be the unpopular opinion on BookTube. But I like this series. I had so much fun rereading the original trilogy, coming back to this world, and I like the time that V.E. Schwab took. I feel like everything was building. There was always something intriguing happening. There's new characters. You're returning to old characters, and then just built and built and built until you got a really, really great explosive ending, and now I can't wait for the second one. So that one's in the top category here. As far as the ones that didn't work for me, they would be Starling House and June Farrow. And I feel bad because a lot of the ones that are in this section, in this category across the years, I don't hate these books. I don't hate them even a little bit, but I don't like them as much as the things that are in the other categories. Something has to go here. And these ones both just were kind of, they were okay. I wouldn't say I really enjoyed them, but I didn't dislike them necessarily to a tremendous degree. Now that brings us to 2024. I already feel as though 2024 has to have an asterisk by it because there, I think, was one single book in the top 10 of the nominees that I had read. I think that's what it was. Almost everything else that I had read was beyond that point. So already, this one in a way, not that what I read is necessarily what qualifies as whether something's good or not, but there were some sequels like the All Souls series. I think the 5th one was in the top 10. And that, I've not read that series. There's definitely no way I was going to read the 5th book by the time that I finished the year of my reading. But I don't know. I feel like 2024 percentage wise, I forgot to say the percentage for 2023. It was 60%. It was 21 out of 35 possible points. But 2024, I almost feel like points should be deducted because I'm not even really interested in a lot of the ones that were in the top 10. I'm not even interested in a lot of the books. So I feel like as a result, this should be lower to accurately reflect my feelings. But regardless, what I had to do for 2024 was go outside the top 10, which I didn't do for any of the other years. I could have gone back and incorporated more books from outside the top 10 from the nominees, but I decided not to redo all those first 4 years. And I would just add that in 2024, I wasn't that interested in a lot of what was, I guess, considered popular. And that's where what we started this discussion with about has it changed? And if it has, where are those shifts? This is the first year I feel like I'm really, or I really did because it's already over. This is the first year I think I really felt that shift. And I think a lot of other people did too, because throughout the year, there was sort of this general feeling of, I'm not hating a lot of what I'm picking up. I'm not loving a lot of what I'm picking up. And what I am loving didn't come out this year. So as an example, I probably don't need to say this again because I find a way to talk about it almost every video, but Age of Madness. Loved Age of Madness. And by the way, what a crime. I don't even think it was in the top 10 nominees, any of the entries, any of the years that I'm talking about, which is tragic. But anyway, so that series was one of my favorites ever now, but certainly one of my favorites that I picked up in 2024. Backlist, though. It didn't come out in 2024. But when I compare that, and even when I compare things that were in the top 10 from 2020, like Rhythm of War, like Addie LaRue, like Empire of Gold, when I compare those to the things that were in the nominees in 2024, I feel like, as I said, the shift has finally reached maybe not its final form, but we're starting to see it, I think, a lot more than we did in the past. I was trying to pinpoint why exactly fantasy feels so different. I noted that the standalone has definitely become more prevalent. On top of that, I think cozy fantasy has become more prevalent. And stories where Travis Baldree, for example, the whole tagline is high fantasy, low stakes. I think that's become true of a lot of stories. You have these lower stakes, and you go into the story. And for me, lower stakes kinds of stories, while there are exceptions, like Irregular Witches was one that I adored, but lower stakes kinds of stories, I think, tend to not reach the lowest of the lows and the highest of the highs the way that the Empire of Golds and the Rhythm of Wars do. These books that are parts of series, so that's another factor here. But as a result of being parts of series, you get to know these characters, you become very invested in these worlds, and you also feel as though there's so much that could go wrong. When things do go wrong, it hits that much harder. But when things go right, oh my gosh, it's just a different kind of experience. I also, for the first time ever, got into Attack on Titan in 2024, obviously manga and anime, not books. But talk about the lowest of the lows. So when you finally get a high moment, it is extraordinary. The feeling, you're like, finally something went right. I mean, the end of season 3 is probably one of the best arcs in anything I have ever encountered. And when I think about just that arc alone, and I compare it to the entirety of books that came out in 2024, which you can apply that to any year. That arc is so exceptional, it's kind of unfair. But that arc alone, I feel like, had so much more to it. And it just rips you apart in so many ways. And it relies on time having been built to get to that point. You are like, I need something to go right for these characters. I know something's going to go wrong, but I also need something. I need them to have a victory finally. You have these emotions, and you're essentially, maybe even literally, but figuratively, you're really truly on the edge of your seat. And every little thing that goes right, you are like, yes. And then the second something goes wrong, you are throwing your hands up in the air. There's just those intense emotions. All that said, let's look at the books and where I place them for that year. The only book that was in the top for me was A Sorceress Comes to Call. I really enjoyed this. I'm a big fan of T. Kingfisher, and for me, this was T. Kingfisher at her best. So Sorceress Comes to Call, absolutely loved. And then a lot of books in the middle. The Bright Sword, A Song to Drown Rivers, The Tainted Cup, The Lost Story, and Map of the Otherlands. I know I had Encyclopedia of Fairies up a little bit higher from 2023. This one, ultimately, I like just a little bit less, which is why it's here in the middle. I only had one in the bottom, which would be The Warm Hands of Ghosts, as this one didn't work for me in a lot of ways. As I already noted, I already feel like there's an asterisk for this year because these were primarily outside the top 10. But of these, you have a total possible score of 35, and the end result was 21 out of 35 because most of them were in the middle, which resulted in the percentage being 60%. If we look at all the years, the worst year for me was 2021. Makes sense. It was right after 2020 and all of the difficulties that came with that year, to put it lightly. And then we went right back up, right? In 2022, I was at 66%. And this was primarily because I liked a lot of things. There wasn't too much that I was like, I don't really like that. So that one was in second place. And then the next two were tied. 2023, 2024 were tied at 60%. Part of that fatigue, I think a lot of us are feeling, fatigue with feeling in the middle, is I think because this is an extension from 2023. I think that it has been actually several years, and it's just kind of starting to have this snowball effect. This isn't a criticism by any means of the Goodreads Choice Awards. That's not what this discussion is. We've had discussions about Goodreads and what we wouldn't mind changing. I don't know if the epic fantasy that I love and that a lot of you love, I don't know if those are going to be really popular anytime soon. But where I can see this being an exception is if a lot of us are feeling this way, then there is this void that can be filled, and publishing has a tendency to notice when there's something that people are craving. I already noted the way that cozy fantasy seems to be providing comfort to a lot of individuals, and it's more accessible. I think for a lot of people that found they had more time to read because of things like 2020, then they were able to come to these sorts of stories. And also, because 2020 was so difficult and the picking up of the pieces from that year was so difficult, I think those books genuinely provided something a lot of people needed. But now that we've had that for a while, I don't necessarily think it's going to go away. I think these trends are going to exist and evolve, but I do wonder if enough people now are going to be feeling that lack of epic. I need to also note, Wind and Truth has finished, and I think for a lot of people, that epic feeling came from the Stormlight Archive, and now that that is in some fashion concluded, obviously it's just the first arc, but with that being completed, it just feels like the potential is there. The doors are wide open, and maybe we're going to get something in the next few years, maybe even in 2025. That'd be exciting. I'm very curious to know, though, if you have also experienced a lot of what I've described, or if you feel very different, and if you followed along and you kind of did this process for yourself, and your percentages turned out to be completely different, what would your assessment be as to where you think fantasy has shifted, how it's shifted, and how it's shifted in comparison to your taste versus maybe my tastes and other people's that you've noticed having conversations online or in your real life? Thanks so much for watching, though. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you later.